Britain, France, and China have all shut down their embassies in Tehran. And at the exact same time, Chinese warships are showing up off Iran's coast in what's being framed as a joint military exercise on a scale we haven't seen before. Behind the scenes, more and more diplomatic missions are telling staff to get out, shifting into high alert mode. When diplomats pull people out while warships move in, this stops being media noise. It starts looking like a major scenario is being placed on the table. And the question that should make everyone sit up is simple. Is the risk of a U.S. strike on Iran in the near future now extremely high? If that's where this is heading, then this won't be America versus Iran. This will be a shock to a critical pressure point in the global system. Because Iran isn't just an oil country. Iran sits next to the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow energy choke point where even a small disruption can shake the entire world economy. And Iran is also a strategic piece that China has spent years embedding itself into. In Beijing's logic, Iran is not just a partner. It's a long-term energy anchor, a gateway of influence in the Middle East, and a platform that helps China reduce dependence on routes and mechanisms controlled by the West. That's why China has poured money into infrastructure, into oil and gas, into long-term agreements that stretch across years. So if Washington chooses a path that breaks the current order in Tehran, whether through direct military force or through a chain of blows designed to collapse the government from within, China won't just see lost contracts. China will see a strategic link being snapped, investments being wiped out, a corridor of influence being shut down. And above all, a dangerous precedent being set, that the United States can use power to cut off China's footholds in regions that matter most. That's when this shifts from a regional crisis into a superpower confrontation. So the presence of Chinese warships isn't just about training, it's a message. It says Iran is no longer an empty stage. If you strike, you won't strike in silence. You'll strike under the gaze of a rival that thinks in decades, and you'll pay a higher price. Now look at what markets fear most in this scenario, the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran feels pushed into a corner, it doesn't need to close the strait in an absolute sense. It only needs to make it more dangerous. A few incidents, a few clashes, a few threats. And insurance costs explode, tankers hesitate, buyers panic. Oil doesn't spike because supply is gone overnight. It spikes because people fear it could be. A surge in oil means a surge in global inflation. Inflation forces central banks to keep rates higher for longer or even push them up again. High rates squeeze businesses, crush consumers, and destabilize labor markets. And if that chain hits a global economy that's already exhausted, 2026 could become the year the dominoes start falling. But there's another layer that's even more dangerous: China's response. If Washington hits Iran in a way that topples the current leadership, Beijing won't need to fire a shot to retaliate. It can retaliate through supply chains. And the first lever everyone talks about is rare earths. Because modern industry depends on small things that become catastrophic when they disappear: electronics components, industrial magnets, defense systems, EV supply chains, batteries, energy equipment, even basic manufacturing tools. If China tightens exports, U.S. companies won't die overnight, but they will choke. Delays, shortages, higher costs. And when costs rise, businesses cut. When businesses cut, unemployment climbs. When unemployment climbs, consumption falls. And when consumption falls in a high-rate environment, recession stops being a theory and becomes a real outcome. That's why this game is dangerous. It doesn't require a total war. It only requires enough stress for the system to lose balance. And don't forget the factor that can make everything explode faster. Iran is unstable. In unstable systems, a small push can collapse the whole structure. A strike that hits the wrong target. An assassination. A protest that slips out of control. A crackdown that goes too far. An incident at sea. Any of these can become the spark in the right place. So when you see diplomats pulling out and warships moving in at the same time, understand what it really means. The question is no longer, is there a war? The question is, the world is entering a phase where even a light touch can blow the whole room apart. In the next part, we're going to break down the three most plausible escalation paths: a limited U.S. strike meant to deter, a broader campaign designed to cripple Iran's capabilities, and the worst-case scenario, where one strike triggers a chain reaction in Hormuz and pulls China into a full-scale systems confrontation with the United States. And at that point, the question won't be what happens to Iran. It will be who pays the bill for this shock. And does 2026 become the year the world enters a new cycle of crisis? Here's how escalation actually happens in the real world, not with one dramatic decision, but with a sequence of smaller decisions that each feel reasonable in the moment. A drone gets shot down. A convoy gets hit. A ship's transponder goes dark. An unknown actor plants a mine. A missile lands a little too close to the wrong facility, and suddenly everyone is reacting, not planning. So if you want to understand what might be coming next, you don't start with speeches, you start with trigger events. The first and most common trigger is a single incident that can be framed as self-defense. That's the key phrase leaders reach for when they want room to move. A retaliatory strike, a limited response, a surgical operation. The language is designed to make escalation feel controlled. But the problem is that the other side gets a vote. In a limited strike scenario, Washington hits a narrow set of targets tied to deterrence. Think radar sites, air defense nodes, drone infrastructure, missile storage, command and control assets. The goal isn't to topple the state. The goal is to punish, signal capability, and restore credibility. It's the classic move of a superpower that wants to appear decisive without getting trapped. On paper, that sounds contained. In practice, it's the most deceptive kind of escalation because it creates pressure inside Iran for an answer. And Iran's answer doesn't have to be symmetrical. It doesn't have to be a direct military exchange. It can be deniable, distributed, and messy. That's how Iran has traditionally played: proxies, cyber, sabotage, shipping harassment, harassment of bases through allied groups, and constant pressure that bleeds the opponent over time. So even a limited strike can open a door you can't close again, because you've just told Iran that force is now acceptable. And Iran will respond in the language it knows best: friction. This is where Hormuz becomes a weapon without being declared a weapon. You don't announce a blockade. You create a risk environment, a few close encounters at sea, a few explosive incidents, a few accidents. That's enough to spike insurance premiums and delay shipping. Markets don't need certainty, they only need fear. The second path is broader and more dangerous. A campaign designed to degrade Iran's ability to fight back, and possibly to destabilize the regime's internal confidence. This is where targets expand from deterrence to capability. More strikes, more nights, more disruption, more pressure. It's still not an invasion, but it's no longer symbolic. This is the kind of operation that can fracture a government because it creates two simultaneous crises at once. One outside, with foreign strikes and economic chaos. One inside, where elites begin to question whether the system can survive. And this is exactly why such campaigns are tempting to leaders who believe Iran is already fragile. If you think a structure is cracked, you don't tap it gently. You hit it in the weak point and hope it collapses. But again, the other side gets a vote. A broader campaign increases the probability of an Iranian response that targets the system, not just the battlefield. That means energy infrastructure, shipping routes, communication lines, cyber operations, and pressure through every proxy channel available. When a state believes survival is at stake, it starts playing a different game. The restraints loosen, the risk tolerance rises, and the lines you thought existed stop mattering. Now, the third path is the nightmare path, the one everyone privately fears but rarely says out loud. The scenario where one strike triggers a chain reaction that drags in the superpower layer. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. China doesn't need to fight the United States directly to make a U.S.-Iran operation more expensive. China can fight the conditions around the operation. It can turn the environment hostile to the global economy. It can use trade, finance, and supply chains as pressure tools. It can expand diplomatic costs. And it can quietly increase Iran's resilience by helping it absorb pressure. In other words, China can run a parallel game. Think about what Beijing cares about most in this moment. Not headlines, not optics, not moral arguments. Beijing cares about preventing a strategic loss that changes the balance of power. If Iran's current order falls and a new alignment emerges, China doesn't just lose energy arrangements, it loses a piece of strategic depth in a region that matters for global trade and for U.S. military positioning. And it loses the credibility of its long-term bet that China can build alternative partnerships even under Western pressure. So if Beijing believes Washington is about to rewrite Iran, it has to respond somewhere. The question is where. Rare earths is one lever, but it's only one. There are many ways to create industrial pain without triggering an immediate military response. Tighten export licensing. Slow customs clearance. Pressure key upstream suppliers. Raise compliance risk for American firms operating in China. Quietly push partners to prioritize non-dollar settlement. Accelerate strategic stockpiling that tightens global markets. All of these actions create the same outcome: more friction, more cost, more uncertainty. And in finance, uncertainty is gasoline. If energy prices rise while supply chains tighten, central banks face a trap. They can't cut rates without risking inflation. They can't keep rates high without crushing growth. This is how economies slide into stagnation. Not because a single shock destroys them, but because the policy space disappears. That's why 2026 looks fragile in this storyline, because the world is already operating with limited slack. Debt levels are heavy, consumers are sensitive, governments are politically constrained, and markets are priced for normal. When the world is priced for normal, abnormal events create outsized damage. Now let's make this even more real. The next phase won't be announced, it will be felt. Watch for the practical signals. One signal is maritime risk pricing. If insurance rates for tankers and cargo vessels begin climbing, if shipping firms start rerouting, if ports quietly adjust schedules, that's the market saying it believes disruption is coming. Markets are often the first to panic because markets are allergic to uncertainty. Another signal is airspace behavior. When airlines begin avoiding certain corridors, when flight paths bend in strange ways, when certain airports lose international routes, it's another sign the risk environment has shifted. These are not political decisions. These are actuarial decisions. A third signal is military logistics. Not the dramatic footage, but the boring stuff. Fuel, munitions, repositioning, increased aerial refueling activity, surveillance patterns, unusual naval groupings, increased readiness posture. Wars are often visible weeks before they begin, but only if you look at the supply chain of war. Now add the internal factor that most outsiders underestimate: Iran's domestic volatility. If Iran's internal situation is tense, every external blow has amplified effect. Economic shocks are not neutral. They land on people. They land on food prices, medicine availability, employment, and social stability. And in a system already strained, that can produce unpredictable internal reactions. This is the moment where outsiders often miscalculate. They assume pressure will produce a clean political change. But internal collapses rarely produce the government you want. They produce chaos, factional struggle, hardliners, crackdowns, and desperate moves. And desperate moves are exactly what close choke points. So let's talk about Hormuz in practical terms. The strait doesn't have to be closed to create global damage. A perceived threat is enough. If ships slow down, if insurers price in risk, if buyers rush to secure supply, the effect is similar. Higher prices, tighter markets, and a wave of inflation that moves across continents. That inflation becomes political. Voters don't care about geopolitics in abstract terms. They care about gasoline, heating, groceries, rent, jobs. That's when foreign policy becomes domestic policy. That's when leaders feel trapped, and trapped leaders make riskier decisions. This is how escalation feeds itself. Now, the most dangerous element in all of this is not malice. It's misreading. Washington may believe China is bluffing and will not escalate economically because it would hurt China too. Beijing may believe Washington won't risk global inflation in an election-sensitive environment. Tehran may believe the threat of Hormuz will deter Washington. And each belief can be wrong at the same time, because deterrence fails when everyone assumes the other side is rational in the same way they are. But rationality is not universal. It's shaped by politics, prestige, fear, and the internal need to look strong. And that brings us to the core question beneath all the noise: what does strength look like to each player? To Washington, strength might look like proving the U.S. can still enforce red lines. To Tehran, strength might look like refusing humiliation and showing it can impose costs. To Beijing, strength might look like preventing a strategic loss and demonstrating it can protect long-term interests beyond its borders. When three different definitions of strength collide in one choke point region, the system becomes unstable. So if you want to understand what comes next, don't ask whether leaders want war. Ask whether leaders can afford to look weak, because that's the real engine of escalation. Leaders don't always choose war because they want it. They drift toward war because they believe the alternatives threaten their power, their credibility, or their survival. And when you combine that with oil, choke points, and supply chains, you get the most dangerous mix in geopolitics, a conflict that doesn't need to become global in order to cause global damage. Now here's the final piece that ties the entire puzzle together. If this spirals, the battlefield won't just be the Middle East. The battlefield will be the global economy itself. Energy shock on one side, supply chain shock on the other, financial tightening trapped in the middle. That's how you get layoffs, rising defaults, political panic, and unstable markets. Not because the world ran out of resources, but because the system lost confidence in stability. And once confidence breaks, it doesn't return quickly. Next, we need to walk through the exact spark moments that could flip this from tension into action, and why the first 72 hours after any strike matter more than the strike itself, because that's when miscalculation becomes irreversible. The first 72 hours after any strike are where history gets decided, not because the weapons are bigger, but because everyone is moving with incomplete information and maximum ego on the line. If a U.S. strike happens, the next question won't be, did it work? The next question will be, what does Iran do in response? What does China do in response? And how quickly does the global system start pricing in fear? Because the real danger isn't a planned escalation, it's an accidental one. Here are the spark moments that flip this from tension into action. One spark is a maritime incident that can't be walked back. A ship gets hit, a tanker catches fire, a mine is found in a shipping lane, a drone buzzes too close to a warship, the wrong radar operator panics, the wrong captain misreads a turn, and suddenly routine tension becomes a headline with flames, bodies, and national pride attached. Another spark is a proxy strike that creates political pressure inside Washington. A base gets hit, a convoy gets attacked, an ally takes casualties. Whether Iran ordered it or not becomes almost irrelevant. Once deaths happen, the domestic political demand for retaliation grows. Leaders stop asking, "Is this wise?" and start asking, What can we hit that looks decisive? A third spark is cyber, because cyber doesn't need permission to escalate. If a major financial network glitches, if critical infrastructure goes down, if a port freezes, if energy distribution gets disrupted, the public doesn't think in probabilities, they think in blame. And blame becomes pressure. Pressure becomes action. A fourth spark is internal Iranian instability, which is the wildest variable of all. If the country is already tense, any external shock can push the internal system past a threshold. A major protest wave, a violent crackdown, a split among elites, a sudden collapse in currency, a scandal, a power vacuum. In unstable systems, you don't get clean transitions. You get unpredictable reactions. And that unpredictability is exactly what closes choke points. Because when leaders feel their survival is at stake, they stop thinking like statesmen and start thinking like survivors. That's when restraint dies. Now let's get brutally practical. What does escalation look like in the first 72 hours? First, Iran will try to prove it can impose costs without inviting total destruction. That means it will likely reach for deniable options. Harassment at sea, cyber disruptions, proxy pressure, uncertainty. The goal is to raise the price while keeping the line blurry enough to avoid giving Washington an easy justification for a full-scale campaign. Second, Washington will try to maintain the image of control. It will describe the operation as limited, justified, and finished. It will claim deterrence, but at the same time, it will quietly shift posture, readiness levels, naval positioning, air defense coverage, and intelligence assets. Because leaders can say contained on camera while preparing for not contained in reality. Third, the market will react faster than any government. Oil will move first. Insurance will move next. Then freight, shipping schedules, and industrial input prices. That's the hidden timeline. The economy reacts before diplomats even meet. And this is where China becomes the pivot, because China has two broad ways to respond, and both are dangerous. The first is the visible response. Presence. More ships, more patrols, more joint drills, more signaling. Not necessarily to fight, but to make the operating environment politically heavier and more complex. To say, you are not acting in a vacuum. The second is the invisible response, friction. Quiet changes that don't look like retaliation, but function like it. Export licensing changes, customs slowdowns, regulatory pressure on foreign firms, stockpiling that tightens markets, encouraging partners to diversify away from U.S.-controlled financial channels. None of these are missiles, but they can hurt. And when you combine energy shock with supply chain friction, you create the most painful environment for any modern economy. Inflation pressure with shrinking growth. The exact policy trap central banks hate. That's why this isn't just a Middle East story. It's a global macro story. If oil jumps, the first victims aren't soldiers. They're consumers. Gasoline, heating, food transport, fertilizer, airline tickets, manufacturing input costs. Inflation creeps back into everything. Then central banks face a choice that isn't really a choice. If they cut rates to support growth, inflation can re-accelerate. If they keep rates high to crush inflation, growth can break. Either way, the political temperature rises. And rising political temperature is what makes conflicts harder to stop. Because when a country is angry, it wants punishment, not negotiation. When voters are hurting, leaders become more reactive. When leaders become reactive, miscalculation becomes likely. Now let's address the part everyone tries to ignore. What if Hormuz becomes the battlefield without being declared one? Hormuz doesn't have to be closed. A perceived threat is enough. Tankers don't need to sink for prices to rise. They only need to hesitate. Routes only need to slow. Insurance only needs to spike. Buyers only need to panic. And panic is contagious. This is why even a short disruption can have long consequences, because markets don't just price today. Markets price the risk that tomorrow might be worse. And once that risk is priced in, it spreads. From oil to shipping, from shipping to costs, from costs to inflation, from inflation to rates, from rates to jobs, from jobs to politics, from politics back to escalation. That's the loop. Now here's the part that turns this into a superpower collision: credibility. Washington cannot afford to look weak if it believes deterrence is on the line. Tehran cannot afford to look weak if it believes regime survival is on the line. Beijing cannot afford to look weak if it believes its long-term strategy is on the line. 3 actors, 1 region, 3 different definitions of strength. That's when the system becomes unstable. Not because anyone wants a world war, but because everyone is trying to avoid humiliation. So what should you watch for if you want to know whether this is turning real? Watch maritime insurance and freight costs. If insurers start pricing the region as high risk, that's the market screaming that disruption is expected. Watch airline routes. If major carriers bend flight paths away from certain airspace, that's not politics, that's risk management. Watch unusual naval clustering, not just one ship, patterns, repositioning, refueling behavior. A boring buildup is often the most revealing kind. Watch financial stress indicators, energy-linked currencies, credit spreads, industrial input prices. The system always shows strain before leaders admit it. And watch one final thing: the language. When leaders stop saying "we urge restraint" and start saying "we will respond," the room is heating up. Because this is the truth nobody likes. Wars don't start when leaders announce them. Wars start when leaders feel trapped by events and pride. And if this spirals, the world doesn't need a global war to suffer global damage. It only needs a choke point crisis, plus a supply chain shock, plus political panic. That's how 2026 becomes fragile in this narrative. Not because the world runs out of oil, not because factories forget how to build, but because stability, the invisible asset that makes everything function, gets repriced overnight. And once stability breaks, it doesn't come back quickly. So the question isn't whether Iran is the target. The question is whether Iran is the trigger, the match that lights a much larger confrontation between systems. Energy on one side, supply chains on the other, finance trapped in the middle. And if that confrontation goes live, the bill won't be paid in Tehran or Washington or Beijing alone. It will be paid everywhere,